Throughout history, humans have pursued dominance over their fellow beings. It appears that the notion of equality is unsettling to some individuals who continue to trample on others to satisfy their own egotism and self-admiration. One could argue that it is in our nature to strive for control over others. This behavior has been observed across all ages and social strata, from ancient Greek and Roman societies to medieval times, and nearly up to the present day. In these periods, the most powerful treated their servants, friends, or even family as mere possessions. Fortunately, such practices are now forbidden, and we possess ways to defend ourselves. But what if we had been born when owning 2 or 3 slaves was considered normal? Or worse, what if we were the slaves? Today, we will explore the lives of these ill-fated individuals who endured enslavement for centuries. Welcome to History Insight. What were the conditions like aboard slave ships? A journey in shackles. Imagine being an 8-year-old African child in the 18th century. Your parents leave, as they do every day, to complete their task. You and your siblings stay home to look after the house until their return. Suddenly, a few men invade your home and abduct you, forcing you onto a ship where you'll be transported as merchandise to serve as a slave for a wealthy family on the other side of the world. This is the story of Olada Ekwonu and countless other children like him who were torn away from their families, stripped of their freedom, and treated as less than human. Once aboard, the captives were disrobed and branded before being led below deck, where space was scarce. They typically lay down, shackled together to maximize capacity, with only a few centimeters of separation for the majority of the journey, which lasted between 2 and 3 months. Throughout this time, they suffered abuse from the crew, often resulting in death. The conditions were deplorable, to say the least, leading to frequent deaths from disease and suffocation. Some even attempted suicide to escape their humiliating existence. So many slaves perished during these arduous journeys that sailors from other fleets referred to the ships as floating tombs due to the putrid odor emanating from them. At least 1 in 5 African slaves perished on each voyage, with the larger vessels capable of carrying over 600 slaves. The death rate decreased after governments introduced regulations for the ships, limiting the number of captives allowed and requiring the presence of a doctor to care for the crew's health. The devastating effects on the cotton gin. Nowadays, cotton clothing is a staple in most wardrobes. It is inexpensive compared to linen or silk garments, but this was not always the case. Prior to the late 18th century, cotton production was not very profitable. Producing 1 pound of cotton lint was costly, despite most of the labor being performed by slaves. Separating the seeds from the cotton fiber was a time-consuming process, taking each slave about 10 hours per pound. In 1792, Eli Whitney relocated from Massachusetts to Georgia with the intention of becoming a private tutor on Catherine Greene's cotton plantation. While residing in the southern United States, he observed a significant issue that handpicking posed for cotton growers. Consequently, he began developing a prototype gin that would effectively separate the seeds from the fiber. With Greene's support, Whitney invented a machine that utilized rotating brushes and teeth to effectively remove seeds from the cotton, revolutionizing cotton production and spurring an increase in plantations due to the textile demand. With the help of this machine, a single pair of slaves could produce up to 50 pounds of cotton fiber in the same 10 hours of work. This rapid and affordable production impacted the supply and demand for garments made from this material, lowering their costs, which in turn led to higher sales and an increased demand for cotton production. Rather than easing the workload of a slave labor, this development intensified the burden on workers, who were commanded to work from dawn until dusk to maximize profits. Coupled with the already harsh conditions, this pushed their bodies to the limit, often resulting in illness or death. Greater demand for raw materials meant more work, and more work required more labor. In the 18th century, an increased need for workers translated to a reliance on slavery. The total number of slaves involved in cotton production rose from 700,000 to over 3 million within just a few decades. 400 years since slavery in America. From the time of ancient civilization, slavery was a crucial component of social hierarchy, with people reduced to mere objects. As it is widely known, individuals with darker complexions, primarily Africans, suffered the most. They were abducted and enslaved by the British, Dutch, and French, and starting in 1619 by the colonists in the United States. In that year, a Dutch ship arrived on the shores of Virginia carrying 20 African slaves. Despite this, the country continued to use native slaves and white European servants until the end of the 17th century. Due to American anxieties about racial mixing with slaves, in 1661, the Maryland Act, the first anti-miscegenation statute, was enacted, prohibiting intermarriage between races. The 1776 Declaration of Independence declared all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. Regrettably, this did not include slaves, and their use became even more widespread. By 1860, nearly 4 million slaves were registered, making up 13% of the nation's population. The American Colonization Society started deporting free Africans to Liberia to prevent political unrest among their descendants. The American Civil War began in 1861 to preserve the United States as a single territory, since the Southern states, under the pretense of protecting rights, sought to secede to continue enslaving people of color. The war eventually shifted its focus to the abolition of slavery, which was achieved in 1865. A few years later, in 1868, the 14th Amendment was enacted, granting African Americans the right to vote and birthright citizenship. However, during this period, segregated institutions emerged that endorsed supremacist ideologies of violence and racial terror. For several decades, through Jim Crow laws, racism continued to significantly impact African Americans under the slogan, "separate but equal." They were excluded from many jobs, their children were barred from white schools, and they were assigned specific areas to drink water. As a result, many African Americans migrated south in 1926 in search of work, but encountered communities' resistance to their integration into society, imposing curfews or outright denying them residency. The Supreme Court attempted to rectify this in 1954, but it was not until 10 years later that President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which mandated the integration of African American children in white schools. By 1965, slavery had vanished entirely, but racial discrimination remained a formidable foe. Some states prohibited African Americans from voting, prompting the creation of the Voting Rights Act, which penalized voting discrimination. What was the slave trade like? The history of slavery has been lengthy, and for many centuries, an integral part of the global economy. Between 1400 and 1900 alone, nearly 20 million Africans were kidnapped to be sold as slaves worldwide. According to Canadian historian Nathan Nunn, Africa's population had decreased by half by 1800. This behavior primarily stemmed from the expansionism of vast territories, such as the Dutch East India Company, which sent expeditions overseas to extend their domains. Settlers conquered these people and forced them to work on plantations, in mines, or on infrastructure projects for new settlements. For 200 years, Portugal held a monopoly on the slave trade, being responsible for transactions involving more than 4.5 million Africans. However, this number could be much higher, as the exact figure for people traded during the 16th century remains uncertain due to a lack of records. The impact on African communities was immense, often causing the disintegration of entire regions and affecting the economies of many others. Today, these issues still impede the growth of countries that lost large portions of their population to slavery compared to those that did not. While overt slavery no longer exists, it is undeniable that a clandestine form of slavery persists, perpetuated by organized crime groups that continue to abduct thousands of people regardless of race. Nowadays, women and children are primarily affected. On the other hand, slavery has transformed into racism, where the descendants of enslaved ancestors face employment and economic barriers simply because of their skin color, their income being up to 10 times lower than that of their white counterparts. Supremacist ideas, hatred towards different and excessive violence have been experienced and continue to be experienced on a different scale by those with darker complexions. Currently, various social movements fight for the rights of diverse groups, including women, immigrants, and African Americans. There will always be someone who feels superior, believing they have the right to trample on others. Whatever the course of history, we'll be here to share it with you, here at History Insight.